We're now going to talk about the most fundamental, important concept in moving from someone that just uses JavaScript to someone that deeply understands it and isn't scared by some of the weird and odder-looking things that happen inside of it. A concept that will expand your knowledge and ability as a programmer to use JavaScript in ways that other modern and popular programming languages can't match. The idea is called first-class functions. In JavaScript, functions are objects. All right, well, first of all, big word alert. First-class functions sounds complicated. Not really. First-class functions means that in the programming language, JavaScript isn't the only language that has first-class functions, but I would say it's definitely the most popular nowadays. Everything you can do with other types, objects, strings, numbers, booleans, you can do with functions. You can assign variables to have a value that's a function. You can pass functions around as parameters to other functions. You can create functions on the fly with a kind of literal syntax. First-class functions change the way you can program. They can open up the horizons to completely different approaches to solving problems. So, when we say that functions are objects in JavaScript, what does the function object look like? Well, just like any object in JavaScript, it resides in memory. It's a special type of object, though, because it has all the features of a normal object and has some other special properties. So, one thing that people are surprised about when they see JavaScript is that you can attach properties and methods to a function. Why? Because it's just an object. So I could attach a primitive, a name-value pair. I could attach an object. I could attach other functions. This actually does happen and can be useful in JavaScript, and we'll see that later. In JavaScript, though, the function object has some hidden special properties. Two important ones are its name. Now, a function in JavaScript doesn't have to have a name. A function then can be what's called anonymous. Anonymous meaning it doesn't have a name, but it can have a name. And there's another property called the code property, where the actual lines of code that you've written sit. So, essentially, from this vantage point anyway that we're talking about, the code that you write gets placed into a special property of the function object. So it isn't like the code that you write is the function. The function is an object with other properties. And the code that you write is just one of those properties that you're adding onto it. What's special about that property is it's invocable, meaning that you can say, run this code. Run the code sitting on that property, and that's when the entire execution, context creation, and execution, when all of that happens. It's imperative that you have this mental model of a function in your mind as we go through the rest of this course. You have to think of a function as an object whose code just happens to be one of the properties of that object. That there are other things that the function can have attached to it. There are other things the function can do, and it can be moved around, copied, and given to other elements or other areas of your code, just like any object or value, just like a string or just like a number. This allows for some fascinating programming approaches, and it allows for some really interesting syntax that can look really weird if you don't understand this fundamental concept. All right, just to prove it, Let's try something. All right, I have an empty app.js file, and I'm going to just type out a function. Let's say function greet, and it's just going to console.log hi. So it's a function. But remember, we said that functions are actually objects in JavaScript. So using dot notation, I can create a property. Let's say language, English. Look at that for a second. Take that in. I just added a property to a function. In other programming languages, this just isn't possible. But in JavaScript, functions are objects, and the code I wrote is just a property of that object. Now, if I was to console.log greet, something interesting happens. In JavaScript, I actually get the text of the function that I wrote. So that's not too useful in this case, but if I actually try to go find that property on that function using the dot operator, there it is. The value's there. It's in memory. It's a property attached to the function, just like you could attach a property to any object. Because in JavaScript, functions are what? Objects. So when I created this function, what did it look like? I had this greet function, and when it was created, this function object was put in memory. In this case, onto the global object. And it had a name. So the name property is greet, because that's what I named my function. And it has a code property that contains the code that I wrote, the body of my function. And so if I was to call greet using the parentheses, that invokes that code, causes it to run, causes that execution context to be created, etc., etc. See how this works? You have to think of a function as more than just this container of code. It's an object, and as such, you can pass it around. It sits in memory at a specific location. It has properties. It has methods. Why? Because, say it with me, in JavaScript, functions are objects. All right, now we're going to see just how interesting this can make our code.